Hello, this is Melissa Hale Spencer, the editor of the Altamont Enterprise. All of us have recently celebrated Thanksgiving and probably bought into the myth of the Puritans having their meal with the Indians, and we're so steeped in this myth that I was shaken to read an account of earlier settlers. Those are the Dutch on Manhattan. And we have with us today the person who is really at the center of the new understanding of our American history. This is Charles Gehring. Welcome.
Hello, welcome. I'm glad to be here.
Yeah, so I wonder if you could just start by telling us a little about what the New Netherlands Project is.
Well, it's actually called the New Netherland Research Center now.
Okay.
Yeah, we have an actual room in the library on the 7th floor with all of the research material that you would need for studying New Netherland.
And this is the 7th floor of the New York State Museum.
Yeah, the New York State Cultural Education Center.
Oh, thank you for correcting my names. That's good to get them right. Okay.
Right, because it not only is it the museum, but it's the state library and the state archives as well. So it's everything is in one large building. But we're on the 7th floor. If you come to the library on the 7th floor, you go to the research center. To go to the research center, go to the reference desk and look to your left, and you'll see the room. And
I understand this is kind of a secret floor. If you get in the elevator, there's no button to push.
No, that's the 8th floor.
Oh, that's the 8th floor.
Yeah,
gosh, okay.
Yeah, it's. I used to be on the 8th floor.
I see. All
and
right.
When Russell Shorto visited me at my office the first time, he couldn't get to me because the elevator didn't have a 8
So
on it.
Just to let people know, what Charlie's referring to is this book by Russell Shorto, The Island at the Center of the World, where he took Charlie's work and made it into a narrative that's riveting and graspable, and he has, and that's why I was passing on misinformation, he has near the start of this book a description of what he calls a soulless building, and in it is this room where Charlie works with all this culture of Dutch heritage in it. So go ahead, I'm sorry.
Right, Russell had moved to the city in the early around 2000 or so, I think. I'm not quite sure, but he was very close to where Peter Stuyvesant is buried. He's in a tomb there at St. Mark's. And he asked people who this person was, because he's from Johnstown, Pennsylvania originally, Russell. Mm-hmm. And he had heard something about the Dutch and so forth, but nobody could give him an answer of what the importance of this place was, and Petrus Stuyvesant. He talked to one person who said you ought to go to Albany and see Charlie Gehring. And it just happened that we were having a seminar or a conference in a couple of weeks, and he came up as a reporter for the New York Times and did an article about the conference, and he was so enthused about the size of the crowd. We had over 100 people attend the conference, that he wanted to know more, and pitched a project which turned into this book, Island at the Center of the World. And he visited me every week for about almost 2 years. He would drive up from Putnam County, where he was living at the time, and did research for the book. So we got to know one another quite well, and he got to know the Dutch very well.
Well, it's just an astounding narrative, but I got you kind of off the track. You were telling us about the New Netherlands Research Center and what your work is there.
Right. Well, what we do is translate the records that were left by the Dutch when the English took over in 1664. They left everything in place in the fort at the tip of Manhattan, and the English kept the records in very good condition because of the land records that were involved. And the English were very concerned about maintaining the provenance of these land papers. So the records were all there. And eventually they were transferred up to Albany after the Revolution. And it's these records that I started working on in 1974. There had been attempts at translations before this, but...
I'm just going to interrupt because you know better than I do, of course. I'm just working off of Russell Shorto's book, but the journey that these records took was just amazing. They started out, when the English had taken over and were sent by stagecoach to Boston and then back to New York by stagecoach. And then during the Revolutionary War, they sat in a ship where they got moldy. Mm-hmm. And then they, after the colonists won the war against the British, they wanted the records back. So they came back. They were in the Tower of London before that. And then there were several attempts to try to do what you've spent your life's work doing. In 1801, a committee of the Assembly in New York wanted a translation, and the director was authored by Aaron Burr, but that never came to pass. And then in 1818, an old Dutch minister whose name I will probably mispronounce, Adrian van der Kemp, is that right?
Yeah, van der Kemp, yeah.
Yeah, he spent 4 years translating it, but apparently it was a really, really flawed, really bad translation. And then it ended up in the fire where somehow, ironically, it was protected because it was on... The translation was lost, but the records were on a lower shelf, and the English records were on an upper
Right, this
shelf.
is the 1911 library fire, which was in the west end of the Capitol building at the time. And the Dutch records, since they weren't used as much as the English records, they were down closer to the floor in about 6 wooden shelves. And the English records burned through the shelves on top of the Dutch records and dropped down and protected the Dutch records from being destroyed.
And that's just so ironic because here the English had kind of tamped down the Dutch history.
I told this story in the Netherlands at a conference, and I got an applause that the English had finally gotten some revenge for the English.
Oh my gosh!
Yeah.
And then there was a man who was a very capable translator, but he appeared to have had a nervous breakdown. Is that right?
Well, he was translating at the time of the fire.
Yeah.
And he had left the very first volume of records on his desk the night before. And when the fire broke out, it burned his desk and the first volume of records as well. And just the damage that he saw, the fire burned for almost 3 days, over 3 days. And all of this work that he had been involved in making a new translation of the records was lost. Not totally lost, but no longer did he have these records that were in perfect condition. Now they were smoldering in many states.
Oh, wow.
The records down along the floor were kept in pretty good condition. The ones toward the top were severely damaged along the edges, and that's a problem that we still deal with today in translating, is because many of them are flawed.
Missing their edges.
With the edges, and they're also heavily discolored because of the heat of the fire. Yeah. Instead of black ink on white paper, it's now sort of dark brown ink on light brown paper.
Oh, gosh.
The contrast is not as good as it used to be, and it's very tough on your eyes. Not only that, but it's difficult to translate what isn't there anymore.
Well, I'd just like to hear more about your own background. That how do you know how to do this? Because as I understand it, the handwriting has changed, and the language, of course, has evolved in several hundred years. I mean, what is your training? How did you come to know this?
Well, I have a degree, a PhD in Germanic linguistics. And
but let's go further back than that. Like, where did you grow up? What was your family like?
All right. So, well, I grew up in a little village. I was born in Fort Plain, New York, in my grandmother's house, in the back room of her house. And after World War II, my father bought a house across the river in Nelliston, New York. And it's a small village. It was a small village at that time, about 600 people. And I think maybe over half of the people in the village had a van in front of their name.
So
they were
Dutch
Van
heritage.
Vechtens, Van Schijks, and so forth.
What about your own family? Do you have Dutch heritage in your own family?
No. Well, maybe going way back. There's a Salisbury on my great-grandmother's side from Rensselaer. But the more immediate ancestors are from Germany and Italy. So I'm half German and half Italian, sort of first generation.
So as a child, were you studious and scholarly? I mean, this is just such an exacting...
Well, this is something that I've struggled with for many years. Our school in Fort Plain only offered Latin and French and languages. And in the 50s, it was sort of the custom that it was the girls in the school who took language courses, French and Latin.
I'm about your age, and yes, that was true.
You remember that?
Yeah.
I don't remember a single boy in my class or in Fort Plain at that time who was involved in either one of those language courses. They were all for the other gender. But when I went to, I was supposed to go to West Point, and I was told by my congressman that he had already given his appointment to a friend. This was a congressman in Utica, and he said if I went to a military school for a year, he would give me a principal appointment. So he gave me a choice of 3 schools, VMI in Virginia, Citadel in South Carolina, and Pennsylvania Military College, which is now Wegner, I think. It's changed. So I went to VMI. I was going to go to West Point because it was free, because you didn't have to pay anything, and my parents really didn't have the income to support 4 years at a regular university. But enough to get me into West Point to buy the uniforms or into VMI for a year. And I actually got the principal appointment for West Point, but I turned it down. I said, "There's no way I'm going to go through another year of this."
Oh, the military training.
Yeah, so I into my third class year, which is the sophomore year, I transferred to West Virginia University. I had become very interested in languages.
What interested you? What sparked that interest?
Well, we had to take most of the courses at VMI at that time were engineering courses, physics and so forth, chemistry, and 2 of the languages that they offered were German and French for science readers. And it was all about reading scientific journals and so forth. But I became fascinated by the languages, and especially German because of my German background. my Italian grandmother kept saying to me, "Why didn't you take Italian? You know, see how easy it is to speak." And then she would say something to me in Italian. I said, "I know it's your native language, but I was never offered to take Italian. It's not as popular as German." And in one of my language classes, there was a Afrikaner. His father was in the South African embassy in Washington, and he was at VMI, and we talked about Dutch and about the Afrikaans. He spoke Afrikaans, so I started gaining interest in the Dutch language, and I started thinking, my God, that's where I come from. I come from a village that has descendants of people who settled in the area in the 1600s. And so that always stuck in my mind. And so I decided to go to a university where I could really concentrate on language. And I went to West Virginia, ran out of money after a semester, came back in 1959. It was jobs were terrible, but I managed to get a job on the railroad. The last year of the New York Central Railroad, I became a signalman in a big signal tower in Utica, and I managed to save enough money to go back to school. Went back to West Virginia, got my BA, then I got an MA. And then I got a Fulbright fellowship to a university in Germany, to the Freiburg, Albert Ludwigs Universität in Freiburg.
And what did you study there?
Germanic linguistics. That's what I wanted to do, was study German. My proposal was on something completely different. It was on the German mystics of the Middle Ages, Eckhart, Tauler, and Suso, the three famous German mystics, and how they had affected the German language, because they had to preach in German to the nuns who didn't learn Latin, so they couldn't speak to them in Latin, so they had to speak to them in the vernacular. And they developed this height and kite that turned action words into nouns. And this is what I proposed as a dissertation topic. Well, when I was at the university, there's a room at the German university that concentrates on your subject matter. A Seminarzimmer, and in this room are all of the books that you would need for coursework on your concentration. And while looking through the books one day, I ran across a book called Crumbs from an Old Dutch Closet. And it turned out to be an investigation of New York Dutch. Lights went off in my head, and I said, my God, this is about the only thing that's ever been written on this subject, and maybe this would be more worthwhile doing than what I had proposed.
Isn't that serendipitous?
Yeah.
You just came across this book, and
yeah.
Lights went off.
And the interesting, or the extraordinary thing is that almost at the same time I got a note. There was no email at that time, of course. I can't even remember. It must have been a letter that I received from one of my friends in West Virginia. He had heard that Indiana University was proposing courses in secondary languages that weren't normally studied, because they wanted to keep these languages alive, and one of them was Dutch and Danish at Indiana University. So I applied for a 3-year fellowship there, and I got it. So I got to study both Dutch and Danish for 3 years, and then I got to be more interested in Dutch. And that's how I ended up really concentrating on 17th century Dutch as a dissertation topic.
What was your dissertation about?
It's the study of a language, a minority language, and the pressure of a majority language over the years. It's a social study of a minority language. In other words, Dutch was being impacted by English after the English takeover, and how the language adapted to this situation.
But isn't that fascinating? Because that's the very core of this book by Russell Shorto, not on the language, but on the culture.
That's right.
How the English culture dominated.
Exactly.
And you studied it at the language level,
right,
as a dissertation.
And then these things in my past kept surfacing. The guy I knew at BMI was an Afrikaner, and he spoke Afrikaans, and the Afrikaans language is a development of Dutch in a area where it was being competed against by English, and so it was a very similar situation. And I was very interested in how the New York Dutch would match up with what had happened in Afrikaans, and simplification of the language, the adoption of loan words, the changes in phonetics in Dutch to make it easier for the majority language. The majority language to pronounce certain words, like in Dutch, you have a u, a uy, as in stuyvesant. It's not stuyvesant,
the way
but
we
it's
say
Stuyvesant. Stuyvesant Plaza, for example.
And I noticed you said his first name differently, too.
Yeah, Petrus.
Petrus.
He went to university. When you go to a university in the middle, in that period of time, you Latinize your name.
Oh, that's right. I remember in Shorto's book, he said he didn't finish.
Right.
Stuyvesant didn't finish, but he still kept that Latinate form, although he hadn't finished his degree.
Right. Yeah.
Well, so now tell us how, with your serendipitous journey, you ended up with the New Netherlands Research Center. What, you were in Indiana, you had finished this 3-year fellowship.
Right. I'm still working on my dissertation. I was looking for a job, and I got one at the University at Albany. The idea was to start a Netherlandic studies program. And it didn't work out because of various reasons, which I won't go into. The guy who was really promoting it got into some trouble, and he was pushed out, and I was teaching German courses, and they didn't want to spend the money to hire another person to do what I was doing at the time. So I was sort of stuck teaching elementary, first, second, conversational German.
Not what you came to UAlbany for.
But they did allow me to teach linguistics as well. I taught a course in general linguistics and developed a course in the growth and structure of the German language, which I taught. So I was able to do something of what I was actually trained for, but I was basically doing very elementary stuff, teaching German. We taught a lot of students, and after 6 years, it was you were proposed for tenure, or you left. And at that time, I think the German department was almost 90% tenured at that time. So it was 6 years and out.
Oh, gosh.
So after 6 years, I was looking for a job again. And it just happened that I had been at the New York State Library. This is when it was still in the education building, the big education
with
building,
with
all the columns.
Front,
yeah. And I knew his wife was from Stone, Arabia, which is in just north of Gehring, New York, north of Palatine Bridge. Stone, Arabia is Steenrapje in Dutch, which means stony turnips.
Oh, my goodness.
Yeah. Lansingburg and Troy used to be called Stone, Arabia originally.
I never knew that.
Yeah, the Dutch were amazed by the amount of these little stones that came up every spring because of the glacier movement of the glacier. Yeah. And so they developed this Stone Arabia, Steenrapje, which develops into Stone Rabi, Steenrabi. You see it all over the place in road names. Out near Oneonta, there's a Stone Rabi Road, and there's a Stone Arabia in New Jersey. But his wife came from Stone Arabia, and my sister lived in Stone Arabia. And so we got to know them, and he was the head of manuscripts and special collections at the New York State Library. So when I was working on reading the original Dutch manuscripts for my dissertation, I got to know him, and he was connected to people in the Holland Society. In New York, this is very complicated.
No, but it's fascinating.
In the Holland Society, who this man was very interested in starting the translation project up again. Van Laar, the last translator who was involved in the fire and so forth, he had died in the 50s. And they were looking for somebody to continue his work. He had 4 volumes of translations that were still in manuscript form, and the idea was to get these published. Well, this guy in the Holland Society knew a publisher in Baltimore. He was from Baltimore originally. And he arranged for having these 4 volumes published. And they wanted to find money also to do to start the project up again. So I when I realized I wasn't going to get tenure, I was looking around for work, and the director or the head of the manuscripts department, Peter Christoph, his name is, he approached me I was in the Mohawk Valley at the time, working at my in-laws' farm, baling hay, putting hay in a Dutch barn.
Oh my gosh.
And he said, I've got a possibility for work if you're interested as a translator. Said, we're looking for somebody to start the translation project up again. And I said, well, I'll do anything at this point. And I never wanted to be a translator. This was something I wanted to teach Germanic linguistics. That's what I was trained to do. And I said, sure, I'll do it. So I got a job in Albany as a translator of the Dutch record, something I've been doing for 45 years now.
That's my question.
Right.
It's not what you wanted to do, but you got hooked in. What has kept you at it? What has sustained you for, 45 years? That's
right. Well, when I first started, I was amazed by the detail and the amount of information in these records. Some of them
12,000 pages, right?
Over 12,000 pages. A lot of them had been translated and published, but not very well. And only the political information, the Great White Fathers syndrome, that was the important stuff that previous translators or editors thought was what was most important. The social information was secondary and needn't be bothered with. And I was amazed at how much there was in the records of social nature. And I said that I thought that this would be an eye-opener for people who consider the Pilgrims as our founding fathers. I said it was the Dutch. I mean, it's the Dutch already doing these things. They were here. The Dutch were here before the Pilgrims. They had already been active in the Hudson Valley in 16 teens, and the Pilgrims don't show up until 1620 along the coast of Massachusetts, Cape Cod, and then move over to Plymouth in 1621 it was sort of late in the year. And the Dutch had already been here, in and out, trading with the Indians for almost a decade. And I said, and nobody knows anything about them.
Well, yes, and still to this day.
Your
work
right.
has opened it up a lot, but I was just amazed because I considered myself an educated person, and I learned so much. I mean, the way, and if you can just talk about some of the kinds of things you've translated, because what Russell Shorto has picked up on is the Puritan societies being so narrow and casting out and punishing anyone that didn't follow that path, whereas the Dutch society in Manhattan was so open and took in these people that were cast out and had such a variety of religions and nationalities, all kind of trading and living together in a very interesting kind of society.
Right.
So, like, what are some of the things that you translated that added to that?
Well, first of all, you have to realize that the Pilgrims lived in the Netherlands for 13 years.
That's right. That's right.
And they ended up over here. The way they're depicted, their dresses depicted, that's all Dutch. The hats and the black outfits with the big white collars and so forth, that's all pretty Dutch. And they brought a lot of Dutch tools over with them and so forth. But the reason they left was because they were basically intolerant, and they didn't want anybody to be sort of contaminated with other religious ideas at that time. And probably the major reason was their children were becoming Dutch. They were learning Dutch. The children were speaking Dutch better than their parents, because they were growing up bilingual at that point, and they wanted to get them to a place where they could control things better, so they ended up in Massachusetts. The Dutch, in fact, a lot of Thanksgiving and so forth was something that they had already practiced in the Netherlands. It was a Dutch holiday and so forth. A lot of the things that they do are attributed to their period in the Netherlands. But that's all going to come out in next year and the year after. There'll be this big celebration of the arrival of the Pilgrims, and we'll hear a lot about that.
Yeah, I guess. But if you could just talk about like the kinds of things in these pages, other than what you called the Great White Father sorts of documents, like what are some of the documents that you've translated that shed light on this culture, this social
Well, the
milieu.
records are mostly administrative records, council minutes, correspondence, land records, laws and ordinances, and so forth. But you also get a feeling for the people, why they're in court, why they're defending themselves for certain things, and you gain an understanding that a different culture is developing here. And the reason for that is that the Dutch at that time in the Netherlands, in Amsterdam, were multi-ethnic. They were coming in from all over Europe into the Netherlands, down the river systems, down the Rhine, the Maas, and the Scheldt. And because the Dutch was a fairly open society at that time, and they were it wasn't an intolerant society. And when we talk about tolerance, we're not talking that, you could just do whatever you want, but you wouldn't be punished for being a Mennonite, for being a Baptist, for being a Quaker, or for being a different religion. And the Dutch called this freedom of conscience. They had already been severely oppressed by the Spanish to become Catholic again. And if you didn't recant, you could be severely punished or even hanged. The Pilgrims were doing this as well in Boston. The last person hanged, I think, was in 1655, was a Quaker woman. The Dutch never hanged anybody. Article 13 of the Union of Utrecht, which is like their constitution at that time, is sort of a defense pact between the 7 provinces that broke with Spain, states that no one will be persecuted or prosecuted for their beliefs. So that's freedom of conscience. And many people came to the Netherlands because of that. A good example is Robert Livingston. His father was a religious dissident in Scotland at the time and was sort of forced out and suggested that he go to the Netherlands. And he took his son, Robert, with him, who grew up bilingual and became a very important person in this area, in fact, in the Albany area. So one of the major attributes of the Dutch is this freedom of conscience, this toleration. As you know, the Netherlands is a very small area, and you have to be able to tolerate people next to you. Otherwise, you're never going to survive. So they knew how to live together, and no matter what your belief was or whatever, what your ethnicity was. So people came over from all over Europe, from a lot of Germans, a lot of French-speaking Walloons, later French-speaking Huguenots, English, people from Central Europe. We have Croatians, we have Poles, people from Lithuania. Asher Levy was a butcher from Lithuania, and he became one of the biggest landholders in New Netherland.
Yeah, I was just amazed. The book focuses a lot on, maybe I'm saying the name wrong, Adrian von der Donck. And it was a figure I never even heard of before. And just, he sort of stands in this book anyway, along with Stuyvesant. I'm saying the wrong way.
Well, no, that's the way we pronounce it, Stuyvesant.
And von der Donck, just this young lawyer from the Netherlands, first under, working as kind of a I don't know, sheriff for the patroon, but, exploring the land and cataloging the natural life and this huge love of the new world. And then his later attempt to try to get a sort of a home rule system, and all that I never knew anything about.
Right.
And here is this really important figure
Yeah.
in shaping who we became as a nation.
Right.
So, as you translated these things, just describe what it must be like to be. Really, you're like Henry Hudson, You're exploring by going through the past and finding these new things. I mean, what does that feel like?
You're seeing the embryo of certain ideals that we have as Americans, mobility of social mobility is a major feature in America. If you're smart, if you have ambition, you can rise to the top. You can, all you have to have is that drive. Of course, you can't become president anymore, it seems, unless you're a billionaire. but it also helped to be married to somebody who had a good...
well, that too is fascinating. And Shorto must have gotten that from marriage records that you translated. Just the intermarriage in different cultures.
Well, this was it.
Was fascinating, but also this idea. And I just was recently reading Alexis de Tocqueville, who came later to America and said that was what differentiated it from Europe. This idea you could pull yourself up by the bootstraps.
Social mobility.
It wasn't inherited wealth
Right.
that mattered.
Very unlike what developed in Boston, for example, where you still had that class structure. And no matter how smart you were, how much ambition you had, you were stigmatized by who you were,
Your
what
bloodline.
social class
Yeah.
you were born into. And it's pretty much that way in England. I think, in many respects, you're sort of stigmatized in many ways by your language, the dialect you speak, and so forth. But here, you start getting a blending of different cultures, and it allows for this social mobility. The Schuyler's, for example, they were when they first came over, they had come from, I think they were boatmen on the Rhine River, Germans probably. And they eventually developed into one of the upper classes of New York in the Hudson Valley and in Albany. Philip Schuyler was a general in the Revolution, and that he went from his family went from the bottom right to the top, and this was a feature that you find in the records, that people aren't bound by their birth or what position they were born to.
So, just in the logistics of translating, how do you decide what order you're going in, and how much have you accomplished, and how much is left to do, and can you do it in your lifetime? How old are you?
Well, I just turned 80.
Oh my goodness!
Yeah,
and you're still working full,
yes, I am.
Full tilt.
Right.
Oh my gosh!
Right.
So, how much of this over 12,000 pages have you translated, and how many pages are left?
Well, that's always a problem, trying to figure that
out.
Well,
roughly,
yeah.
Are you halfway
I would say
through?
we're probably in the 75 to 80% range of this one corpus of records. We're talking about what was in the fort. Remember,
right,
in 1664. Right. These are the official administrative records of New Netherland. There are also other records, the patroonship of Rensselaerswyck, for example. There's even more information there, and a lot more social information.
But are you thinking you can finish this in your lifetime? Or
no, I don't think I would ever see the end of it.
You're going to live to 100?
Yeah, well, the problem is that when I began, we were always looking for financial support. The project was funded for 1 year when I started.
Through Nelson Rockefeller, was it?
Right. It was actually Ralph de Groff, who was the member of the Holland Society, who knew Nelson Rockefeller. Nelson Rockefeller had just become vice president. And he said, could you have Malcolm Wilson, who had become governor of New York to replace Rockefeller, to put some money into a translation project. And Rockefeller also had interest in the Dutch, and it seemed like a good idea. So they funded it for 1 year. And after the funds ran out, I was cut loose. I had to find money from other sources. I had a desk. I was still in the old building on Washington Avenue, and I had access to the records and so forth, but I had to find money from other sources, and we got money from a couple of foundations. And then the bicentennial happened in '76. That was there was a lot of money available for various projects and so forth, and I became one of the projects for about a year. That kept me going for another year. I have no benefits at this time. I'm completely yeah. But there was nothing. It was very tough going for a number of years. But as it worked out, as things sometimes do, NEH in Washington was starting up a translation program as part of the National Endowment of the Humanities. Went down and visited them, and they said that next year we're going to put money into translation projects. If you can wait for a year and if you can apply for it, in the meantime, you can apply to this other program called the NHPRC, National Historic Records program, to do a guide to the records, Dutch records in the United States. So I got money for them for a year that led me into the NEH project. So it was one of those things that was sort of year by year, and they dovetailed nicely because I got to find out where all of the other Dutch records were in America, and was able to then get this grant from NEH. It was a matching 50-50 grant. We had to raise money every year, and I did that for 32 years.
Oh my gosh! So really, this wouldn't have happened without you. It took one person to keep it going. I mean, now it's been declared a national treasure. Is it safe now? Is your salary like a secure thing at this point?
I actually, a number of years ago, I actually got a position in the education department.
Well, congratulations.
Yeah, it's
hard won.
I won't go into any details about it, but it is fairly stable. I think you never know. Anybody can be cut.
But the dedication to your work is astounding to me.
Well, this is when you see what the potential is. in the documents, and that you're going to make this available for researchers who can't read 17th century Dutch. Now, you could be someone who can read Dutch, but to read the handwriting is a different matter. It's a different form of writing, and it's a secretarial hand that the Dutch developed for their clerks and secretaries to regularize the maintenance of records in the Netherlands. It's very uniform, but it's a major stumbling block for anybody wanting to learn 17th century Dutch.
I bet, but also Russell Shorto writes that you can just, you yourself, not anyone else, can just tell by glancing at this is Stuyvesant's handwriting, or this is you know these people by their hand.
Stuyvesant's handwriting is the worst. He obviously didn't learn the secretarial hand, but was probably taught by his father, maybe, who was a dominie.
A minister, right?
A minister, yes. And it's very difficult hand, but once you get used to it, it's still a problem, but you get through it. But the majority of the material we deal with is by trained secretaries, and after a while, it's almost like a typewritten document. It's so regular.
Really?
Yeah, the Dutch were one of the first to develop a regular handwriting for keeping records. Yeah, it's it really helps a lot.
I bet, but
because
still.
you're dealing with so many other obstacles with the damage to the records and so forth, and then the language itself has changed over the years. It's the equivalent would be if you read Shakespeare
Elizabethan English
without the notes at the bottom.
Right.
If you read Shakespeare, then you glance at the notes and you see, well, I didn't really quite understand that. These words have changed over the years. There are different expressions, and they're all noted. But you have to discover all of this on your own when you're reading 17th century.
So is there any thought to who will be carrying on this work after you?
Well, a woman works for me. She's been with me for 30 years, 35 years now, Yanni Fenema. And she is now translating on her own, and she will take over when as director of the New Netherland Research Center. There are other people out there who do work in this area as a sideline, not as a full-time job, and they can be called on. We're not alone. In other words, there are other people, but they don't do it full time.
Well, we've run over our time because this is so fascinating. Do you have any closing thoughts for people? Anything we haven't touched? And I'm sure there's a lot, but just
look in your attics for documents.
Really, do people
I've been
find
after
them?
people for years to especially in the Mohawk Valley as well. I've had all kinds of people approach me. Oh, I've got these records and they're in a hand I can't really read and so forth, and I'll bring them in someday, and it never happens. Very rarely.
But do people actually unearth things in their attics that are valuable?
Sure.
Yeah?
Yeah, they don't know what they are anymore.
Right.
And a lot of the stuff is just thrown out.
Oh, my.
Yeah, and right now we're involved in a project. It's a Bible project. The Dutch, if they had one book in their house, they had the Bible. The Dutch had the Bible translated into Dutch by 1628. It was done. It was finished. And so you have these big Dutch Bibles. They weigh 18 pounds with metal clasps to hold the covers together. And it's the only paper that they have in their house at the time. So when somebody dies or somebody's born, they'll write on the blank pages in the beginning or at the end, just before the covers. Mm-hmm. All of this information, genealogical information. And they also write unusual events. I have an earthquake in the 1750s, a flood in Albany that no one has ever recorded, that ran for 3 miles north and south of Albany and destroyed a lot of houses. This was in 1720. Snow falls right up to the eaves of the houses. Things like that, unusual events. So we're going around to various places and looking at the Bibles. I just went through 128 Bibles at the Albany Institute, and we have somebody photographing the pages that I designated now for copying that have information in them. The Holland Society has done the same thing, and this will all eventually be put online so that we have this information that is one of a kind. It doesn't exist anywhere else. Yeah. The Bible, we know what the text of the Bible is. The Bible is both that stuff that's written on the blank paper. That's what's of interest. So if you have any Bibles, a Dutch Bible, let us know. I'm at the New York State Library, and if you put in Charles Gehring at NYSED, that's New York State Education Department .gov, you'll reach me.
Well, thank you.
My pleasure.